Hello everyone and welcome back to Cadia Stands. Today we've got a little bit of a different video from the normal fare. I'm going to be ranking every Astra Militarum vehicle in the Codex, plus a few noteworthy additions from Forge World based on how effective and practical they would be in modern combat. So without further ado, let's just jump right into it, starting out with the Basilisk. Now, the Basilisk is a classic SPG or self-propelled gun capable of providing indirect fire support to troops from miles behind friendly lines. Indirect fire has been a staple of combat for centuries at this point, and the Basilisk is no exception. It bears some strong resemblance to some modern self-propelled guns, and overall it is a fairly realistic vehicle, so I'm putting that at an A. Now, next up, we've got the Valkyrie aerial transport. Now, this thing bears a very strong resemblance to the Russian Mi-24 helicopter, which also combines transport capacity and heavy firepower. These things are capable of dropping elite troops behind enemy lines or supporting fast attacks, and overall, really represent some great real vehicles in the world today. So I'm actually going to give the Valkyrie our first S of the day. Now, next up, we have the Scout Sentinel, your classic chicken walker like an AT-AT from Star Wars. Now, the bipedal motion of the Sentinels would in itself be problematic, as we haven't really figured out how to do that here on Earth. But just assuming that they've figured out that method of locomotion well, um, it's a pretty promising idea, being able to traverse terrain at relatively high speeds while packing a little bit of firepower. In a scouting role, this seems to be a good idea. Not so much in open combat, but we'll get to that when I get to the Armored Sentinel. So I will give the Scout Sentinel a solid B. Now, next up, we have the Manticore. Now, the Manticore bears pretty strong resemblance to some of the multiple rocket launchers of today's armies, like the US HIMARS, for example. Um, so, pretty similar to the Basilisk in that it's an indirect fire unit based on the Chimera chassis, but also really just as realistic, although the rockets and some of the finer details are maybe a little bit more comical. I'm still going to give it a solid B. Next up, we have the Deathstrike missile launcher. So very similar to the Manticore, but instead of four smaller missiles, we have one giant one here. And the proportions here are a little comical, especially on the missile itself. But again, there are real world analogs like these Scud missile launchers used by Iraq in the Gulf War. Although the proportions, again, are pretty comical on this one, it does have real world analogs. So, again, I'm putting this in the B tier. Now, next up, we have the Armored Sentinel. Now, this is probably going to be pretty low on the tier list here because although the Scout Sentinel I ranked fairly high, in an actual tough pitched battle situation, when you're sending out these armored sentinels, those legs would be obvious glaring weak points for your opponents to shoot at. So I really can't put the armored sentinel nearly as high as the scout sentinel. So that is going to be our first F of the day, actually. Next up, we've got the Wyvern. This mounts 4 powerful Storm Shard mortar launchers. Now, this is an interesting vehicle. It's mounted on the Chimera chassis, as are a lot of these, but doesn't possess the range of a lot of other vehicles. This would be designed more for urban combat situations. And it honestly looks decent in that role. It doesn't look especially realistic. You don't have an entirely closed gunner's cockpit, so you'd be vulnerable to sniper fire or fire from the tops of buildings. So I think in the urban combat situation it's designed for, it wouldn't fare as well as you would hope. So for that reason, I'm putting it down in the D tier. Next up, we have the Taroks, and this is an absolute comedy of a vehicle with the wheel tracks, which are an incredibly odd design. But that's not even the most flagrant design issue with the Taroks, but rather the fact that the guns are mounted directly behind the doors. So if your troops actually need to dismount the vehicle in combat, they're going to get shot by the Torok's own guns, which is just a huge design flaw. So for that reason, that is an easy F tier. Now, next up, we have the Chimera, and the Chimera is got to be one of the most sensible vehicles in the entire Imperial Guard arsenal, as an armored personal carrier, mounting decent armament and providing good protection for its occupants. Bears a lot of resemblance to the Russian BMPs or the United States' M113 armored personal carriers. Just a very sensible vehicle overall, providing good troop protection against at least small arms fire and maybe light artillery, while giving the troops good firepower while advancing on an objective. So really a sensible vehicle with a lot of real world analogs. So I'm going to go ahead and put that up in the S tier. Next up, we have the Rogel Dorn battle tank. Now, I've said before, I'm not a huge fan of the way this looks, how you've kind of got a cast looking turret mounted to a mostly welded hole. And the track design is very odd. It's not very uniform. The lines in the tank are not very uniform either, but those are for the most part stylistic. But the real problem is just the amount of guns on this thing. In the hull, you have I think, 6-barreled Gatling cannon. And I'd imagine that would take up a very large amount of space inside the hull. So it looks like your troops are not really going to have, or your crew rather, are not going to be able to fight very effectively inside a vehicle when most of the vehicle's hull is taken up by all these various hull weapons that the Rogel Dorn mounts. So I'm going to go ahead and give the Rogel Dorn a D, because it's not as terrible as the Armored Sentinel and Torox, but definitely not the most crew-friendly design out there. Now, next up, we have the Lehman Rust battle tank, a classic Astra Militarum vehicle, but not that practical. It's got a very, very, very high profile, especially with that gigantic hull. You've got a very small turret, so you're going to have cramped crew. It's going to be difficult to reload, and you've got not a ton of sloping on the frontal armor, so vulnerable to conventional rounds, anti-tank, what have you. So the Leman Russ not scoring very highly at all. I think I actually will put that below the Rogel Dorn into the F category just because of that massive profile, comically small turret, and no armor sloping. So may ruffle a few feathers, but the Leman Russ is just not realistic. Next up, we have a Forge World vehicle. So this is the Gorgon troop transport. And at first glance, it looks like a parody. I mean, it looks like it would never work. However, it bears some resemblance to the Amtrak APC used by the United States. It was an amphibious vehicle used in the Pacific theater of World War II. And it kind of looks like it's combined with a LCM, or landing craft mechanized, used by the Allies as well. So honestly, not a terrible looking vehicle. I mean, providing some protection to the troops while rolling up an opposing beachhead or up to a trench line or a series of defensive works. So really not too bad. It's got some real world analogs. So I'll actually give this, let's see, a solid B. Next up, we have the Vulture helicopter, or not helicopter, but the Vulture gunship. So this is, if the Valkyrie was an Mi-24, this is much closer to a Huey Cobra gunship, sacrificing all transport capacity just for maximum firepower. So that, in terms of the battlefield role, very realistic there. I have no idea, however, what is going on with the engine, given that the intake fan for the engine is mounted directly behind the cockpit. So if you're a pilot or a gunner on one of these, you will not be bailing out. I think it's safe to say. I have no idea how that engine would work. I think the cockpit would probably block a lot of that airflow into the engine. So not incredibly practical there. So real battlefield role, similar to real world counterparts like the AH-1Z, but the design of it is pretty dang comical. So I'm going to put that down at the C tier. Next up, we've got the Hades breaching drill. So it bears some resemblance to some commercial drills used, say, in the digging of the English Channel Tunnel or some subway tunnels. But the concept of breaching enemy fortifications by digging under them to either compromise their structural integrity or build tunnels to land troops inside has been around for centuries and millennia, from Greco-Roman times all the way up through the world wars, really to the modern day. Tunnels used extensively in Vietnam, etc. So it honestly, although a lot of these tunneling machines are not dedicated military vehicles and are generally more commercial, it does seem to fill a battlefield role fairly well, though I think the design is a little comical. So I'm going to put that up as a solid B. Next up, we have the Cyclops demolition vehicle. Now, this is actually modeled almost directly after a German vehicle that saw limited use during the Second World War called the Goliath. It was essentially a remote-controlled tank that they would drive near enemy vehicles and remotely detonate. So very clear real-world analog, very clear battlefield role, although it, I believe, had some mixed successes. They were used primarily on the Eastern Front, I believe. Very close to a real military vehicle, and for that reason, I'll put it up at the A tier. Next up, we have the Hellhound. Now, through World War II and then even later in Korea and Vietnam, there were flamethrower tanks, whether those be adapted Churchills in World War II or Shermans or some other later tanks. Flamethrowers have gone out of style increasingly recently because of the volatility of the fuel that you have to carry for that flamethrower to work effectively. And it's just an absolute liability to have moving up in your lines, as reflected in game with this vehicle exploding on a 4, 5, or 6 after it's destroyed. So although at some point it was used, especially in the Pacific in World War II, to flush out enemy defenses and bunkers, not so much in favor recently, though I'd imagine if you're fighting these protracted battles in hardened emplacements, it's possible that flamethrowers could come back. So a solid vehicle, and I'll give it a solid B. Now, next up, we have the Baneblade Super Heavy Tank. Without a doubt, one of the coolest tanks in the Astra Militarum arsenal. However, not the most practical. The idea of a super heavy tank was floated extensively in the Second World War, primarily by the Germans. But towards the end of the war, it became apparent that effective enemy artillery or airstrikes would render these gigantic vehicles absolutely obsolete, and they would be destroyed before they ever engaged the enemy. And I believe that the same thing would happen to the Baneblade. It also suffers from some of the same issues with the Rogel Dorn, with bad crew layouts, limited traverse on some of these sponson weapons, and just kind of an overcomplicated mess of weaponry. Although that does fit the 40K aesthetic, not very practical in real life. So sadly, the mighty Baneblade will be getting an F. Now, last up, we have the Hydra anti-aircraft vehicle mounting 4 powerful autocannons. Just right off the bat, this looks like a whole lot of different self-propelled anti-aircraft guns. The ZSU-23 comes to mind, the M16 MGMC from the Second World War. So these kind of multiple gun configurations used to engage aircraft rapid fire weapons, very, very common. In modern day, this would be less so because using these conventional rounds like cannons, you have to be engaging at very close range. Typically, you'd want to deal with the enemy a lot further out than that. Though in the 40K universe, for better or for worse, a lot of the combat takes place at far closer ranges than it has any right doing. So I will give the Hydra a solid B. And with that, that is the end of the tier list. Looks like we've got a lot of vehicles in the B tier. We've got a couple standouts with the Valkyrie and the Chimera up in the S tier. And then a lot of the classic vehicles like the Leman Russ and the Baneblade not exactly making the cut in terms of realism, though, of course, very, very cool vehicles. So thank you all for watching, guys. I hope you enjoyed. Let me know down in the comments what you'd like to see next on the channel. And until next time, Cadia stands.